I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss updates from across the battlefront, speaking to Telegraph correspondent Nicola Smith, who's on the ground in Donbas, and Dom Nicholls, who's been travelling with the British Defence Secretary in Oslo, Norway.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 15th of June, day 112. And today I'm joined by Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, Telegraph Correspondent Nicola Smith, and our Defence and Security Editor, Dom Nicholls. But before we get into our conversation with Nicola, here's a few key updates from Ukraine. The industrial city of Severodonetsk is under intense bombardment as Russia focuses its offensive on the Donbas region in an effort to secure a swathe of eastern and southern Ukraine. Moscow's forces have intensified efforts to cut off beleaguered Ukrainian troops remaining in the city and have said that they will open a corridor to allow civilians to flee the besieged factory. The Russian Ministry of Defence has claimed its forces have destroyed a depot containing NATO-supplied arms in western Ukraine. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said further artillery support for Ukraine will be discussed by members today, while Russia indicated it would be willing to consider a UK appeal over the fate of two Britons sentenced to death. And finally, according to an audio clip posted on Tuesday by Ukrainian authorities, Russia discussed sending Ukrainian prisoners of war into minefields to clear explosives in Mariupol and other recently captured towns. Nicola, thank you so much for your time. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are and what you've been seeing the last few days?
Hi, can you hear me okay? I'm just sitting by the side of the road and we're just sitting next to the sign that says "Welcome to Donetsk." So here we go. And there's a lot of lorries going past us just now. I don't know, you might be able to hear that in the background, but it seems that there's supply trucks going down towards the east. There's a lot of soldiers on the roads as well, heading towards the front. And we're going to a town called Pokrovsk, which is close to Kramatorsk and closer to the front lines in Luhansk and Donetsk. And we are going to just speak to people there about the problem that Ukraine is having just now with the huge levels of attrition. They're losing a lot of soldiers. Officials are now saying up to 200 soldiers a day. And we are going to just speak to, hopefully, military officials down there and also go to hospitals, speak to people who've come back from the front lines. So we started out in Lviv in the west, and we've been working our way gradually eastwards. And we spent some time in Kyiv, which I talked about last week, and we also went to Dnipro. So we're just progressively going closer to where the battles are and just trying to find out as much information as possible.
And Nicola, when you talk to the soldiers, what's their morale like? What kind of things are they telling you?
Well, I know that there were several reports last week saying that morale was low, but we just haven't found that. Anyone that we've spoken to has been positive. Obviously, it's horrific for Ukraine, and it's just a horrible thought, having to go into battle, and people are very much aware of just the terrible conditions that they're going to face. But we spoke to one soldier yesterday in the hospital who survived a shelling. He was in Luhansk, so he was on the front line, and he said that the shelling was constant, that from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. the Russians were throwing everything that they could at the Ukrainians, and they could barely come out of their bunkers. And he said, though, that morale was still high, that they're defending their country. Everyone keeps saying, this is our country, this is a defensive war for us. We're just trying to push the Russians out of our homeland. So we haven't detected any sense that morale is low. What people keep saying, though, and he said this, from soldiers to senior government officials, is that we need artillery, we need equipment. We'll do this battle, we'll fight this battle, but we need support. We need support from the West. We need everything that you can give us to push the Russians back, because they're so they're just so outmatched when it comes to artillery. We interviewed Mikhailo Podolyak, who is one of President Zelensky's senior advisors, and we interviewed him last week, and he said that tens of thousands of soldiers could die if they don't get the equipment that they need. He was grateful for the UK sending MLRS systems, but said we don't need three. We need 300. They need anti-aircraft weapons. They need drones, and it's just not coming. And people are just questioning why there are these delays. They're questioning why they're not getting more backup from the West when, so many young men are dying every day. And I think if you're talking about morale, I think the sense here is that people are just despairing that they're not getting the help that they need. And we went yesterday to the funeral of a soldier. He was 46. He died a week ago. And it was just heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking to hear a mother wailing for her son, crying over his coffin. And we went to the village where he grew up. The entire village turned out. Everyone was just sobbing. So when you're talking about 200, up to 200 soldiers are dying every day, it's, that scene is being replicated all around Ukraine. You've got more heartbroken families, and they just keep saying, please send us the weapons.
Moving on to talk a little bit about your other reporting, you've written a piece titled "Inside the Donbas Chemical Plant," where the families are sheltering. This is the Azot factory in Severodonetsk, so scene of quite heavy fighting. The Azot factory has come under the scope. We've heard a lot about it because it's where the civilians are hiding. Can you tell us about what people told you about the conditions and their life in this plant?
Sure. We met a family. We met a man and his elderly mother and mother-in-law on a train in Dnipro. They started out in Pokrovsk, where we're going to now. It was an evacuation train, and we went on board just to speak to people about what they had been fleeing. And it turned out that the three of them had been sheltering in the Azot chemical plant for about 2 months, and a lot of civilians, hundreds of civilians, went there with their families. It was mainly workers at the plant and their families went there to shelter because there were old Soviet era bunkers that were safe. These bunkers were created in strategic locations around the country and reinforced so that people could shelter in times of crisis. And so there were several of these shelters there. They spent most of their time underground. He said that they were relatively comfortable. It wasn't home, but they did have bathrooms. They had running water, and they also had humanitarian aid coming in. So they did have food. But he said it started to get quite frightening when Ukrainian soldiers were fighting with the Russians, and when they were within the premises of this factory, then obviously there were shells coming in response. And he said that he and his mother and mother-in-law took the opportunity last week to evacuate with the military, and they got out. But when he left, he said there were still hundreds of people there. And those people are believed to still be trapped. I think the latest estimates we have are about 500 civilians, including about 40 children, who are in that plant. It's been struck directly by the Russians. And one of the frightening things about it is that it's not just a question of artillery fire. It's also a question of the very dangerous chemicals that could leak and could kill people as well. He said that he was part of an emergency response team who were reacting to any damage to containers. He had to, on one occasion, put on protective gear and gas masks and go and plug holes in a tank full of ammonia gas. So huge risk to the civilians who are there now. The Russians have destroyed the 3 bridges around Severodonetsk, so it's much, much harder to evacuate people, and it's also much harder to get humanitarian aid in. So you can only imagine the fear that people are living in, and also the terrible conditions that they'll have to endure now.
Absolutely. Well, I'm conscious as well that you don't have much time with us, and I'm sure Francis and Dom have some questions as well. So I'd just ask you, can you talk as well about the story you and Ilya Novikov wrote from Irpin, so back when you were travelling towards Donbas, and you met a group of fathers who've banded together from the suburb to defend their country. Who were they? What did they tell you?
Well, we went to Irpin, which was previously, before the war, it seemed to be an idyllic commuter town on the outskirts of Kyiv. There were a lot of families there, people commuting into work. It seemed like a very pleasant place to live, but it was one of the towns that was the worst hit when the invasion started, and the Russians went there and shelled buildings. They did so many terrible things that have been widely reported on. And when the invasion started, a lot of neighbours just banded together. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find, and rifles, hunting rifles. They found guns somewhere, and they just started to defend their homes and their families. And so we went to meet one of these groups, and they were all from the same community. They had found some kind of mismatched uniforms, and they made a little badge for themselves called the Hedgehogs. And so they were the Hedgehog unit, and they fought the Russians. They were just, ordinary fathers, family men. One was a truck driver, one had a furniture business, one was a salesman, and they just came together and they defended their streets. They set up a barricade. They tried to shoot at the Russians. They tried to protect their families, to get their wives and kids out. Several of them are now, their homes have been destroyed. And they're still working together, patrolling, just kind of taking on some kind of security role, even though it's peaceful there now. But they're also training. They're training with foreign trainers. Someone we met the other week is a British trainer, and he's involved in helping them to just become a bit more organised in terms of their fighting skills, in terms of how to use a weapon. And they said to us, look, we are willing to go east. They know how terrible the fighting is in Donbas, but they're willing to do that. They're willing to go east if they're needed, and if their forces need backup. And I think that again speaks to this question of morale. People don't want to fight, but they will do it, and they're willing to do it, and they're willing to step up. And that was the message that they gave us.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Francis, I think you had a question.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, you spoke a moment ago, Nicola, about the discrepancy between, on this question of morale, between perhaps how it's being reported in the West and what you're seeing on the ground. I'm just wondering if there are other examples of where you think the what's being understood collectively in the West about what's going on in the conflict feels different to you actually being there. Are there any other big differences?
I think that's the main discrepancy, really. I mean, it could be that some people are feeling low morale, but we just haven't met anyone like that. Obviously Ukraine the officials have to try somehow to keep up public spirits, but I don't think it's just pure propaganda. I think people genuinely do want to fight for their country, and they do want to defend their homes, because nobody really expected to come under such a vicious assault from Russia, but so many people have stepped up to do something about it, whether it's fighting on the front line or whether it's becoming involved in humanitarian aid. Ilya, who is our local translator and helping us with the reporting. He was saying that, in this war, everyone's lives now are defined by before and after the war, and that everybody has a role somehow. And, that could be providing for a soup kitchen or helping refugees, internally displaced people to escape. And I think that I just haven't really seen or heard anyone on the ground who's been speaking about how low morale is.
And your situation right now, you're by the side of the road on the edge of Donbas. Can you see signs of the war getting closer? I mean, can you hear the sound of distant explosions, or is that over the next hill?
We're still quite far from the fighting at the moment. The town that we're going to was struck on the outskirts by a missile, I think, a few days ago, but it's still relatively secure. So we're not seeing or hearing any sounds of artillery. But what has changed since we left Dnipro about 2 hours ago is that we're just seeing a lot more military on the roads. We're seeing tanks go by on the backs of lorries. We're seeing supply trucks coming down. And we're also seeing trucks full of soldiers and sitting in the back, and you've just got to feel for them, where they're going. It must be a kind of terrible feeling of apprehension as they're heading towards the front lines.
And we've asked this question of quite a few of our correspondents who are out in Ukraine, but how do the Ukrainians, the civilians and the military react to you as a British journalist? At the beginning of the war, we spoke to Danny, who told us that they were extremely positive. Is that changing with the sort of ever so slightly slow delivery of arms and things like that, or is it still a broadly positive response?
It's still a very positive response. Anyone I speak to, even, we went to a memorial wall yesterday, and there was a family there, and then they heard that we were British and they started praising Boris Johnson. So everybody's very positive towards the UK, especially. They feel that the UK is the only country that stepped up. And they said, I interviewed another battlefield commander, who said, well, yes, there are delays. There are delays to weapons, but at least Britain has stepped up. At least Britain has offered something. And so we are very grateful for that. And there's a lot of gratitude towards the UK. There is still the reality that they need so much more. But I think that Ukraine is looking at other countries and saying, why aren't you doing it? They're just very, very happy that the UK has stepped in somehow.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up on that specific point, which is how are other countries being viewed in the context of this conflict now? I'm thinking particularly France and Germany, perhaps Poland, the Czech Republic. How have you registered a difference in attitudes? How much is the big international discussions taking place around concessions and things like that being registered on the ground?
Well, there's a lot of resentment and frustration with big countries like France and Germany that they are not sending weapons that they could, and also that there was a lot of anger at President Macron when he suggested some kind of compromise over Donbas, and that went down very badly. People are just not willing to give up their land because they said it's not going to stop at Donbas. Russia will just keep pushing, and you have to stand up to a bully. So there's definitely a lot of frustration towards bigger European countries that are not helping Ukraine. And then on the other side, there is a lot of gratitude towards, say, the Baltic countries who understand Soviet aggression and who are giving a lot of moral support in any way that they can. And so I think there's definitely Ukrainians are definitely very aware of who's giving them support and who is not, and what is taking place in international discussions, and they're trying to influence the narrative as well, and just keep putting out this message that we need weapons, we need artillery, we need rockets, we need anti-aircraft guns. And they're all on message. Every official, it's actually quite easy to get access to people because they want to put out that narrative. And they've been very good at doing that, but it's just a question of who is listening.
Just one more question from me, Nicola. Thank you so much for your time, because we realise you do have to go. You've been in Ukraine now for quite a few days. What would you say is your biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think my biggest takeaway, and I said this last week, is just how resilient people are and how they have adapted. Everyone has been forced to adapt to a situation that no human should face. Some people are obviously in more danger than others, but it's a very traumatized country. People are dying. People are losing loved ones. So many people have lost their homes. It's so shocking to see. In Irpin, for example, we saw a children's playground which was untouched by artillery fire, where little kids were just playing, and it was, colourful slides and swings, and it was next to burnt out shell of what was once a modern apartment block, and people have nowhere to go. So everyone is being tested, but people are really powering through, and they're finding a way to deal with major trauma. They're finding a way to not only deal with it, but also to discover what can their contribution be, and how can they help each other, how can they help their country, how can they contribute to this fight against Russia and defending their homeland. And I think that's my biggest takeaway so far, just how resilient people are and how much courage that they're showing.
Well, Nicola, thank you very, very much for your time. I would say to all of our listeners, do follow Nicola. She's currently in Ukraine, going into the Donbas, reporting for the Telegraph. So she'll be writing lots of fascinating and, I'm sure, incredibly moving stories. So thank you very much, Nicola. We appreciate you coming on and sharing what you've seen.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like at this point to bring in Dom Nicholls, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor. Dom, you've been in Scandinavia, you've been in Norway the past few days. That's why you haven't been in the studio. Can you tell us what you've been doing and what you've seen?
Sure, yeah. Hi, David. Hi, everyone. And Nicola, if you're still on, great to hear from you. Please stay safe. So I'm in Norway now. I'm stood in Oslo Airport. So if you hear sort of noises in the background, I apologise for that. That's an international airport for you. I've been with the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. He's left now. He left a little while ago. He's now in Brussels for a NATO defence ministerial meeting. But Ben Wallace was here to meet the other defence ministers from the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force. That's the 10-nation force from kind of Northern Europe, Iceland, UK, the Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I got through it. So the 10-nation JEF force, and it was one of a regular meeting, a series of meetings. The JEF have been pretty good on supplying weapons, so it wasn't so much it wasn't at all a finger-wagging exercise, and it was obviously to keep the pressure on there to sort of gee everyone up. And what they did announce was there's going to be a fund set up, a JEF fund for Ukraine, where countries, if they don't have weapons and ammunition, they can just send money into this big pot, and then it will be decided at these regular meetings what that will be spent on. And on the back of that, although the money didn't come from the JEF fund because it's literally just been set up, but Britain's just announced that they have bought on the open market some 155mm self-propelled artillery guns that they're going to send out to Ukraine. I haven't yet found out what equipments they are. I don't know what nature of 155 self-propelled artillery, and I also don't know where the open market is. I don't know where you go to look for these things, or whether or not you ring around your allies and say, have you got any spare 109s or 777s, and we'll buy them off you. So not quite sure the mechanism, not quite sure the numbers or the nature of that weapon system, but there's more artillery going from Britain. So Defence Secretary was here. We were asking him all about the proposed visit, or the expected visit, into Kyiv by the leaders of France, Germany and Italy, and what message they'll be taking. And I asked him specifically, I said, are they going there with a message of unity, to say that this is a show of European unity and support for Ukraine, or are they going with a message of unity from the point of view of an argument saying it's time to face up to negotiations and needed to cede land for peace type thing? I mean, that's not my view, as regular listeners will know, but I asked if Mr. Wallace thought that was what they would be, Mr. Macron, Schultz and Draghi would be taking to Kyiv. He said he didn't know. There's no reason why he would know. I think that's correct. But he said he hoped they were taking the message of European unity. Of course, hope only gets you so far. And we will see. He did make the point that they have offered stuff. France, in particular, the Caesar 155 self-propelled artillery piece is a very capable weapon system. There have been other bits and pieces, but there's obviously all the tensions that we are aware of around the issue of weapon supplies. He was very pointed though in his. It was asked sort of why Ukraine matters. Why does this war matter? And he said, well, the ripples here. This is a quote. Ripples here will be felt in the Pacific. And he said, Ukraine matters because China is watching. And if so I said, well, okay, so what lesson would China take if there's a negotiated peace and Putin remains in power, with Russian forces holding about a fifth of Ukrainian territory? What message would that send to, or what lesson would China take from that? And Mr. Wallace said, quote, that the West lacks resolve, unquote. He said, I'm going to continue the quote there. He said, I'm not going to go into speculation on Taiwan, but this is ultimately about the West's resolve to defend its values. That's it. This applies, therefore, to all sorts of people who have a different view of the world, or indeed who are adversaries or indeed competitors. They will look and test that resolve and gauge how far they can push it, end of quote. So, he sees it very much in terms of the here and now and European unity, but also he's looking at the lessons that would be taken by autocracies around the world, and in particular China, and with a view to Taiwan. I'll just take a little pause there, let you get a breath.
Thank you, Dom, and thank you again for calling in from Oslo. Francis, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, this seems very in line with some of the things you've been saying over the past few weeks.
Yes, well, I think we've all shared that view on the podcast. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating hearing that straight from Ben Wallace. I mean, did you get the sense, Dom, that is something that is a uniquely British perspective on this? Or do you think that is something that there is a more unified agreement on amongst the NATO powers and in the West more broadly? Just, I'm interested to get your perspective on that.
I think things are moving so fast, there is no unified consensus at the moment. So, for example, what I mean by that is Finland and Sweden are almost certainly going to join NATO. We spoke, in fact, if we've got time on this, I can, or maybe tomorrow, let you know Ben Wallace's thoughts on Turkey. He's hoping to visit Turkey in the next few weeks, and certainly before the NATO conference at the end of this month. So he's hoping to go and help Turkey come to an arrangement about their issues with Sweden in particular, but Sweden and Finland joining NATO. So lots more to come there. But I think it's expected that they will join, in which case the 10 nations in GEF will also be in NATO. So what does that mean? Well, that's very interesting, because if you've got GEF pride themselves, I mean, Ben Wallace keeps calling them the Northern European beer drinking club, those that will turn up on day one of any punch up. So if you've got that in NATO's 30 members, but huge differences of opinion, as you'd hope and expect in a diverse group such as that. So it can sometimes be a little bit slow off the mark. But if you've got these nations in the GEF, and let's face it, if you look at the geography, that then turns the Baltic Sea, the Barents Sea to a certain degree, but certainly the Baltic Sea, into a sort of GEF-y NATO internal lake. So very, very hard for Russia to act there with impunity. Very hard to resupply Kaliningrad in the event of any hostilities. And what it does do is it allows GEF almost to be the kind of vanguard of NATO. And if there were hostilities or some kind of ratcheting up of tension, GEF nations could operate in an area of sort of useful ambiguity, if you like. So Russia wouldn't know, or any potential adversary, but for shorthand I'll say Russia, wouldn't know if that's NATO operating or GEF, and therefore is there an Article 5 element to this, or are these individual countries stepping up to the task at the time being? So I think it's very, very helpful, very good that all 10 GEF nations are almost certainly going to be in NATO. It offers another another mechanism for NATO to act, and for those nations that will stand up for these values to act. So I think things are moving fast. Putin didn't want more NATO on his doorstep, but that's exactly what's happened through this stupid war. And he's also now looking down the barrel of the Jeff nations having a bigger role than might otherwise have been. So if it was just a nice, I don't mean to be disparaging, but a nice club of exercising nations, it just adds another quiver to the sort of security architecture of the West. So I think it's too early to say. It'll be very interesting to see what comes out of the NATO ministerial today and tomorrow, and then in particular the big NATO meeting at the end of the month, which I'll be going to, and hopefully doing this from there. So it'll be very interesting to see the messages that come out of that, and the pledges of support, not just in equipment, but also very importantly in training. If we're now taking the long-term view here and saying that this war is going to go on for at least months, maybe years, 8 years obviously since the 2014 invasion, so no guarantee this is going to be over in a few short months, then we need to start thinking about long-term training and putting in those training pipelines and the money and the barracks, the physical accommodation for all this stuff. So there's a lot of other ways that nations that might not be able to supply the big heavy weapons can lean in here. I don't think there's a consensus view yet of what should go where, but there are enough sort of big beasts in the room trying to pull along the whole group through a number of different mechanisms now.
I just have two very quick follow-ups on questions on what you were saying, Dom. I mean, you've obviously been in close contact with Ben Wallace and the Ministry of Defence since the beginning of the conflict. Just wanted to ask what your sense was of the kind of morale within Britain and within the Western powers generally. Has there been a shift? Is there any sign of fatigue from our perspective? Nicola was talking about this concept of morale in Ukraine, but I just wanted to get a sense if you've registered any difference in mood. And my second sort of question, just on what you were talking about, China and Ben Wallace's remarks there. Do you think that it's fair to say that NATO powers now see China as a sort of hostile entity? Because if so, that is a drastic shift in the last sort of 10 years or so.
Well, the latter point first. No, I don't think they'll be talking anything like that language now. That really is to use phrases like hostile entity would be quite a ramping up of the discourse. They're nowhere near that. Certainly. Competitors, challengers. There are occasional confrontations. I mean, Australia had that recently with their aircraft being or airspace violations, and the way that China's operating near other aircraft in international airspace. So occasional confrontations, but no one's talking in those terms yet. If you look at as I mentioned, I think on Monday, the comments from General Wei Fenggu at last weekend's Shangri-La Dialogue, the International Institute for Strategic Studies Security Forum in Singapore, he was very, very punchy in his language. But then they generally are, the missives we get from China are quite colourful, quite use language that you might not get in the West. So you might see it coming from that side, but not from NATO yet. Onto the first point, I don't see any dimming in the resolve from MOD, and certainly not from Ben Wallace. I mean, he talks in terms of being in the right place at the right time, as far as he's concerned. He knows, I think, every European defence minister by first name. He's got a great relationship with them all. I think haven't detected any signs of any poor relationships there. You can pick the phone up to any of them and meets regularly through all the different mechanisms that I've just been describing. So no, I think he's, well, if you can enjoy this situation, I don't know if you can, but for a politician, it's the challenge of a lifetime. And I think he is feeling that he's best placed to it. He doesn't want to change. I've kept inviting him to make comment about leadership bid with Boris Johnson. He wasn't going anywhere near it, and I do actually believe him on that front. So there you go. That's tomorrow's headline. We could get that completely wrong. but no, I don't think he wants to go anywhere. I think he feels he's in the best place to contribute as he can, and he's not resting. As I say, in the next few weeks, we're expecting him to go off to Turkey to try and help out on that front. So no, he's views he's in the right place at the right time.
Just one last one from me, Dom. We've talked a lot about the European powers and their perspectives on the war today. We haven't talked about America, and I'm conscious that we've got a lot of American listeners. How much is America at the forefront of this conversation?
Well, that will come out in NATO, I think. This has been the bits and pieces I've been concentrating on just recently. It's been a very much a European love-in, but we will see. I think President Biden's attending tomorrow, I think. We'll get more from the US side in the next few days. I mean, the US they've been far and away the biggest suppliers of equipment and money. Political support you could take a view on, but in terms of material, I mean they're far and away showing the lead there. There have been a few, as we've discussed many times, a few gaffes, a few slips from President Biden that could do with a little bit of tightening up. But I think they're absolutely where the world would want them. Maybe a little bit further on, if possible, please. But no, there's no split between America and other NATO members.
Dom, just one question from me before we move on to the final thoughts from both of you. I know you've been in Oslo for 2 days now, so you might not have seen too much of the news that's going on. For today's podcast, we were going to do the updates separately at the beginning, as we had Nikki calling in from Donbas, so we didn't want to keep her waiting. But is there anything big from today or from yesterday that you think is worth mentioning and worth for our listeners to pay attention to that's been happening in Ukraine?
Well, maybe not so much in Ukraine, but I would keep an eye on the grain and the maritime axis. I think Turkey are coming around to the idea that they are absolutely central to that, either unilaterally or bilaterally, possibly Bulgaria, Romania, any other sort of Black Sea facing countries. But in terms of doing something there, I think they are central. I get the impression they sort of want to do something, but they like to be seen to be critical to it, as they are. They're rightly so. So I think just keep an eye on movements there around grain and the maritime flank and Turkey's role in particular.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Dom, do you have any? We realise you have to catch your plane back to the office. So, any final thoughts from you?
No, I'm literally being hassled through security now. I'm afraid I'm going to have to go, but I'll speak tomorrow.
Right, very good. See you tomorrow. We look forward to whatever little trinkets you've brought to us from Norway. Francis Dearnley, would you like the final word then?
Yes, well, a really fascinating episode today, hearing from both Nicola and Dom. My only sort of final thought is, and I'm conscious you're going to be recording sort of more updates later, David. My only final thoughts are relating to some listeners will be aware that there's been a big announcement yesterday from Russia that it's blacklisted 49 UK citizens, including defence officials and journalists, and some of those include several from the Telegraph. I know Joseph Barnes, who's appeared on our podcast, is one of those who has been sanctioned. Our editor Chris Evans has also been sanctioned, as has Con Coughlin, who's one of our defence writers. And there are numerous others as well. Catherine Vernier of The Guardian, Ted Verity of The Daily Mail, correspondents Sean Walker and Luke Harding of The Guardian, Sophie Ridge from Sky News, Kathy Newman of Channel 4 News. And the Russian academic Mark Gerletti, who I also believe has done things for us, certainly on the comment pages, but I think he's also done interviews with us in the past. So I just wanted to comment on this and say that clearly the work of journalism in Britain is a concern for the Russian state, and I think if anything, that just shows the importance of the work that we're doing. And who knows, maybe there's a file on this podcast in the FSB, but we don't know. But yes, I just wanted to comment on it and say that this is a war on many fronts: military, in terms of food, in terms of energy, in terms of cost of living, but it's also about freedom of information and the kind of world that we want to live in, where there is such a thing as free journalism, and being able to have the kind of conversations, the challenging conversations that we've had not only today but in recent weeks. And so I just thought I would flag it as a final thought that whilst it sort of pales in significance to all of the military developments this week, I just thought I would flag it and say that a lot of this stuff is going on in the background, and I think it matters on a different plane.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis, and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Sophie Coe.